Welcome back for another deep dive. You know we love tackling the topics you're most curious about, and today is no exception. We're diving deep into recognizing the signs of anxiety in children.
A topic that's so relevant to so many of us.
Absolutely. We've got a ton of great material to dig into.
We do.
Articles from some really reputable institutions like the NHS,
Yes.
the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne,
Mm-hmm.
some advice columns from parenting experts,
Wonderful.
and even some research studies and things like that.
Lots to unpack.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because I was reading that studies suggest that up to 20% of children may experience anxiety that actually impacts their lives.
Really is a staggering statistic, isn't it?
It is. That's like several kids in every single classroom.
It really highlights how crucial it is to understand childhood anxiety and how we can best support our children.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. Before we get into the specifics of all this, can we just clarify what we're even talking about when we say anxiety in children? Like, how is that different from just like normal childhood fears?
It's a great place to start. Anxiety is really about anticipating a future threat. It's that persistent feeling of worry or dread that can linger even when there's no immediate danger present. Fear, on the other hand, is a direct response to a real or perceived threat right in that moment.
So, okay, I think I'm getting that. So, like, if a child is afraid of a barking dog that's right in front of them, that's fear.
Exactly.
But if they're constantly worried about maybe running into a dog on their way to school,
Yeah,
even when there's no dog around, that's more like anxiety.
you got it. And that distinction is crucial because it helps us figure out, when a child's reaction is a natural response to something that could be scary
Right.
versus when it's something more persistent.
Right.
That might need a little extra attention.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I remember reading in one of the articles, and this surprised me, that a certain level of anxiety is actually normal and can even be a good thing.
Absolutely.
Can you explain that? I can. It's kind of like a built-in alarm system in our brains. It helps alert us to potential danger so that we're ready to take action. In small amounts, it can really help us do better, too. Like, imagine a kid who's nervous before a test. That nervousness can actually motivate them to study harder or to focus better.
Yeah, it's like those butterflies you get before a presentation, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they can actually give you that boost you need to do well. But I guess too much of even a good thing can become a problem.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. When does helpful motivation turn into something that feels overwhelming and starts getting in the way of a child's life? That's when we know something needs to change.
So we've established that anxiety is different from fear.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit can actually be helpful,
Yeah.
but it becomes a problem when it's excessive
All right. That's right.
and starts impacting a child's life. Okay, so I noticed a lot of the sources we've got really emphasize how anxiety can look different depending on the child's age and where they're at developmentally.
Sure.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. So as kids get older, their understanding of the world grows, right? And their anxieties kind of grow along with them. So what might be a big scary thing for a toddler might not even faze a teenager.
Right, right. That makes sense. So what are some of the things that tend to make kids anxious at different ages?
Well, think about toddlers. They're just starting to figure out that they're separate from their caregivers.
Yeah.
So a lot of their fears are about being separated from those caregivers or maybe being startled by loud noises or encountering things that are unfamiliar.
Oh, that reminds me of my nephew. He was terrified of the hairdryer when he was little.
Exactly. It's all about that sense of security and independence they're working on. Now, as kids move into preschool and elementary school, their anxieties can start to reflect their growing imagination. They might be scared of the dark, or monsters under the bed, or even thunderstorms.
So their fears change as they start to understand more about the world around them.
Exactly. And then with teenagers, you're dealing with a whole different set of challenges. Think about social acceptance, academic pressure, figuring out what they want to do with their lives. These are huge anxieties.
It's like each stage of development comes with its own unique set of worries that mirror what they're going through at that time.
But I imagine even though these anxieties might be common at certain ages, most kids kind of grow out of them naturally as they mature and gain more experience, right?
You'd think so, and in most cases you're right. As kids learn more about the world and develop those all-important coping skills, many of those fears fade away. But sometimes a fear sticks around longer than you'd expect, or it becomes so intense that it really interferes with their life.
Right.
And those are the times when we want to pay really close attention.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, it's a sign that there might be something more going on that might need some extra help.
Exactly.
So that brings us to a really important question. What are some of the signs that a child's anxiety might be more serious and needs professional attention? That is the question, isn't it? And one that we are going to get into in much more detail as we keep going with this deep dive.
Awesome. Can't wait to hear more.
Recognizing anxiety in kids can be tough because it's not always super obvious.
Right. It's not like they always just come out and say, hey, I'm feeling anxious.
Exactly. It can
Yeah.
be subtle, and it often shows up in different ways depending on the child.
So what should parents and caregivers be looking for? What are some of those signs that might suggest anxiety is at play?
Well, the first thing is to pay attention to any changes in your child's behavior, their mood, their physical well-being, anything that just seems off or out of character, especially if it keeps happening.
Got it. So like a change from their usual baseline.
Exactly. And when we talk about specific signs, it can be helpful to think of them in three categories: physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, and behavioral changes.
Okay, that's a helpful way to break it down. Let's start with physical symptoms. What are some of the things that might point to anxiety?
Anxiety can actually show up in a lot of physical ways. Things like headaches, stomach aches, fatigue, or trouble sleeping. Maybe your child starts complaining of a tummy ache every morning before school,
No.
or they have a hard time falling asleep at night.
So sometimes those mystery aches and pains that don't have a clear explanation could actually be a sign of anxiety.
Exactly. And it's super important to remember that the child isn't faking these symptoms. The anxiety is real. It's causing real discomfort.
Wow, I never thought of it like that.
It's their body's way of expressing what they might not be able to put into words yet.
That's fascinating. What about emotional signs? How can anxiety affect a child's mood and emotional state?
You might notice your child is more irritable than usual, or tearful, clingy. Maybe they withdraw from things they used to enjoy, or have
Yeah.
trouble concentrating.
Oh, okay.
Worry, fear, sadness, those are all common emotional signs of anxiety, too.
So basically, any noticeable change in their usual emotional patterns that sticks around could be a red flag.
Yes, especially if there's no other obvious explanation for it.
Right. And then there's the behavioral stuff, right?
Exactly. And there are a lot of different ways anxiety can impact behavior.
Okay, I'm curious to hear about those. What are some examples?
Well, avoidance is a big one. An anxious child might start avoiding things that trigger those feelings of anxiety.
Oh, yeah. Right.
So a child with social anxiety might avoid parties or social gatherings, while a child with separation anxiety might not want to go to school or sleep alone.
Yeah. It's like they're trying to protect themselves from those overwhelming feelings.
Exactly. And sometimes the avoidance can be a little more subtle. They might make excuses to get out of things,
Oh, I see.
like suddenly feeling sick right before a school event.
Right, right.
It's their way of coping, even if it's not the healthiest way to deal with things long term.
And sometimes their schoolwork might suffer. Right.
Absolutely. Anxiety can make it really hard to focus and learn effectively.
That makes sense. Are there any other behavioral things to look out for?
Sometimes anxiety can lead to something called regression.
Regression.
Yeah. It means a child might go back to behaviors they'd outgrown, like thumb sucking or bedwetting,
Wow, I never knew that.
or maybe more frequent tantrums. It's like they're looking for comfort in those familiar things from a time when they've felt safer.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. So we've talked about a lot of different signs here, but it sounds like the most important thing is to really pay attention to the big picture. Look for patterns in your child's physical health, emotional well-being, and behavior.
Exactly.
And if you see things that are causing them distress or getting in the way of their life,
Yes.
that's when it's time to reach out for help.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, I know there are different types of anxiety disorders that children can experience. Can you talk a bit about those? I think it would be helpful for our listeners to understand how anxiety can show up in different ways.
Absolutely. Some of the most common ones we see in children are separation anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, phobias, obsessive compulsive disorder, and panic disorder.
Wow, that's a lot. Let's start with separation anxiety. What does that look like in kids?
Think about a child who gets really, really upset when they have to be away from their parents or caregivers. They might cling to them, have nightmares about being separated, or even refuse to go to school or sleep alone.
That sounds so hard for everyone involved.
Yeah.
What about social anxiety? How is that different from separation anxiety?
So separation anxiety is about being away from loved ones, but social anxiety is more about fear of social situations. Kids with social anxiety might feel really uncomfortable or scared at parties or school events,
Right.
maybe even just interacting with other kids.
Okay.
They worry about being judged or
It's
embarrassed.
more about worrying about what other people think.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that it's different from shyness, which is totally normal.
Right.
Social anxiety is a lot more intense, and it can really impact a child's life.
And what about generalized anxiety disorder? How does that present in children?
Kids with generalized anxiety disorder tend to worry a lot about lots of different things,
Mm-hmm.
often things that are unlikely to happen or that they can't control. School, family, friends, world events, anything can trigger those worries.
So it's not about one specific thing. It's more like this constant sense of worry that's always there.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And all that worry can lead to physical symptoms too, like feeling tired all the time, or having muscle tension, or trouble sleeping.
Sounds exhausting.
It really can be. Now, you also mentioned phobias, right?
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about what those are?
A phobia is basically an intense, irrational fear of a specific thing or situation,
Okay.
like a fear of spiders, or heights, or the dark, or storms. Sometimes these phobias develop after a bad experience, but not always.
So if a child was bitten by a dog, for example, they
Yes.
might develop a phobia of dogs.
Exactly. But not everyone who has a bad experience develops a phobia. It really depends on the child, their personality, and how they cope with stress.
Right. That makes sense. Now, what about obsessive compulsive disorder? I feel like that one can be a little confusing.
You're right. OCD can be a bit more complex. Kids with OCD have these unwanted thoughts or obsessions that make them really anxious.
Oh.
And to deal with that anxiety, they do repetitive things or compulsions.
Oh, I see.
They might wash their hands a lot or have to arrange things in a certain way. It's like they're trying to control the anxiety by controlling their environment.
So the compulsions are a way of coping, but they don't really solve the problem.
Exactly.
And finally, you mentioned panic disorder. What's that like for kids?
Kids with panic disorder have these sudden, intense episodes of fear that we call panic attacks.
Oh, wow.
They might feel like they can't breathe, their heart is racing.
Scary.
Yeah, and it can feel like they're going to faint or even die. These attacks can come out of nowhere, which makes them even scarier.
So they don't always have a clear trigger.
Right. And
Yeah.
then the fear of having another panic attack can actually start to trigger more attacks. It's a vicious cycle.
So anxiety in children can really take many forms. But it sounds like the common thread is intense fear and worry.
Absolutely. That's really the hallmark of anxiety disorders. And it's so important to remember that these are real conditions.
Yeah.
They're not just phases kids will grow out of.
Right.
They need understanding, support, and often professional help.
So if a parent suspects their child might have an anxiety disorder, where should they go for help? What's the first step?
The first step is always to talk to your child's pediatrician. They can help rule out any other medical issues and give you advice on what to do next.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So the pediatrician can be like the first point of contact.
Exactly.
But I'm curious, what happens after that? What are some of the treatments for anxiety disorders in kids, and what can parents do to support their child throughout the process?
Those are all great questions and ones that we're going to dive into as we wrap up our deep dive.
So we've covered a lot of ground on anxiety in kids. We've talked about the signs, the different types of anxiety disorders. Now let's get practical. Let's say a parent is listening and they think their child might be struggling with anxiety. What can they do? You mentioned the pediatrician as a starting point. What happens next?
Right. So the pediatrician is a great first step. They can rule out any other medical issues that might be going on and kind of point you in the right direction. Often, they'll recommend seeing a mental health professional,
Okay.
someone who specializes in working with kids, like a child psychologist or a psychiatrist.
So what happens when you see a specialist? What are some of the treatments for anxiety disorders in children?
Well, the good news is there are a lot of effective treatments out there, and the sooner you intervene, the better. Therapy is often the first line of treatment, especially a type called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
I've heard of CBT, but I'm not sure I really understand how it works. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. It's kind of like a detective game, where the child, with the help of the therapist, becomes a detective of their own thoughts and feelings. CBT helps kids understand that connection, how their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all influence each other. And then it gives them some tools
Right.
to identify and challenge those negative thoughts that trigger anxiety.
So it's about teaching them to think about things differently, to see things from a more balanced perspective.
Exactly. It helps them develop coping skills to manage those anxiety symptoms and to face their fears.
So they learn to take control instead of letting the anxiety control them.
That's the goal.
I like that. Are there any other types of therapy that might be helpful for kids with anxiety?
There are, and it really depends on the child's age, their development, and the type of anxiety they have. Play therapy is a great option for younger kids.
Oh, yeah.
It helps them express their feelings and work through those anxieties through play.
That makes sense. Play is how kids learn.
Exactly. And family therapy could also be really helpful. It gets everyone involved in creating a supportive environment for the child.
So the whole family learns how to deal with your anxiety.
Yeah, they can learn how to communicate better, how to support each other.
We talked a little bit about medication earlier. Is that something that's commonly used for anxiety in kids?
Medication can be an option, sometimes in combination with therapy, especially in cases where the anxiety is really severe or if other treatments haven't worked. But it's important to talk to a doctor
Right.
to weigh the potential benefits and risks for each child individually.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah.
Now, beyond professional treatment, what can parents do at home to help their child? I mentioned just creating a supportive and understanding environment can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. The home environment is so important. One of the most powerful things parents can do is to encourage open communication. Let your child know that they can talk to you about their worries and fears
Wow.
without being judged or dismissed.
So even if those fears seem irrational to us as adults,
Yes.
we need to validate their feelings.
Absolutely. Don't minimize or dismiss their anxiety. Try to really understand what they're going through, empathize with them.
Right, let them know that you get it, that it's okay to feel anxious.
Exactly. And reassure them that you're there to support them.
What are some other things parents can do?
Teaching relaxation techniques can be really helpful. Simple things like breathing exercises, muscle relaxation, or even mindfulness can give kids some tools to manage those feelings of anxiety when they start to feel overwhelmed.
Like a toolbox of coping strategies.
Exactly. And routine can be very grounding, too.
Oh.
Having consistent routines for bedtime, meal times, homework, that kind of thing, can create a sense of structure and security.
Because anxiety often thrives on uncertainty.
Exactly. But we also need to teach kids to be flexible, too.
Oh, right.
Life throws curveballs, and we need to be able to adapt.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Right.
Structure, but also the ability to roll with the punches.
Exactly. And another important thing is positive reinforcement. Focus on praising your child's efforts to face their fears, no matter how small. Celebrate every victory.
Build their confidence.
Yes. Show them that they can do this. And remember, you are their role model. Kids learn by watching us. So be mindful of how you handle stress and anxiety. Model those healthy coping strategies.
That's such an important point. We're always teaching them, even when we don't realize it. So showing them how to cope in a healthy way is one of the best things we can do.
I completely agree.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
I feel like we've covered so much about understanding anxiety in children and how to best support them. So, to our listeners, remember, early recognition and intervention is key. Don't be afraid to reach out for help if you need it.
That's right.
There are resources available to help you and your child thrive. And that wraps up our deep dive on anxiety in children. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious and keep those questions coming.